Welcome to my virtual book launch for my 9th Crispin Guest medieval noir, A Maiden Weeping. The new book and medieval crime are intimately intertwined, as you will see. The series. It's pretty amazing to me that we've gotten this far, and with many more to go. But in A Maiden Weeping, we finally get into a medieval courtroom, and with all the sleuthing Crispin has done, we haven't touched on that before. As you may or may not know, Crispin Guest, my detective, is a man who has experienced much, from being raised in wealthy households and groomed as a knight, to the great fall he endured by committing treason against the boy king Richard II in favor of putting his own mentor John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, on the throne. Losing his title, his lands, his wealth, and all that defined him, Crispin was forced to reinvent himself as the Tracker, a man who finds things for a fee. In the new book, Crispin awakens in a strange bed after a night of passion when he finds the woman dead, murdered. Drunk, Crispin scarce remembers the night before. Did he kill her? Could it have to do with the mysterious tears of the Virgin Mary kept under lock and key by a close-lipped widow? A relic that a rival family would kill to get their hands on? What does this relic, that forces empathy on all those surrounding it, have to do with murder for hire? With Crispin shackled and imprisoned by the immutable sheriffs, who would just as soon see Crispin hang than get to the real truth, Jack hits the ground running and procures the help of a fresh young lawyer to help them solve the crime in a tense medieval courtroom drama, searching for the answers that will set his master free before Crispin hangs for a murder he didn't commit. This is a map of Crispin's London. London proper was only about 3 square miles within the old city walls, but it was already starting to trickle outside those original barriers, stretching to Suffolk below the Thames, and up into Smithfield, Farringdon, and Portsoken. He lived in such close proximity, worshipping in the same parish church, of which there were many more than is depicted in this map. Fetched water from the same cistern, shopped at the same shops, and generally knew one another intimately. London itself was divided into these parishes or neighborhoods that sat within larger districts encompassing many parishes, called wards. This division made it easier for the justice system to take care of business when there was a death. This is Newgate Prison. It was indeed a gate in the medieval walls in the city. It was one of 7, and served also as a prison. It remained in use as such from 1188 to 1902. That's a good long run. There are a lot of myths about the lawlessness on medieval streets. Was it more lawless than streets today? Doubtful. The courts were busy and efficient. There were perhaps an overabundance of lawsuits, just as there is today. After all, we get our judicial system from England with its terms and practices, but some say there were too many laws. There were sumptuary laws, an attempt to regulate consumption. They were designed to restrain extravagance, particularly against inordinate expenditures for apparel, food, furniture, and housing. It was a moral regulation, but it also made certain that the monarch looked better than everyone else. But as with most morally based laws, they soon fell out of fashion. There were laws pertaining to human waste disposal. For instance, you weren't allowed to dump your chamber pot out the window. Those poor, unsuspecting passers-by below, and having the filth on the side of your own house? Kind of surprising you'd have to make a law, but similarly, you weren't allowed to dump them in the gutters of the streets, though lazy servants often did. You were to dispose of them properly in your privies, either the private ones you had in your own courtyards, or the public ones along the Thames, though garderobes and castles simply emptied into the moat. Lovely. If you owned multiple properties on the same street, There were laws preventing you from building bridges between them, because it got to be ridiculous with so many of them. They became a hazard for men on horseback, and they blotted out the sun. So, just how did criminal cases proceed? First, a little history of law. The coroner. The first mention of a coroner is pre-Norman, in 871 AD, and we don't know his function then. The coroner, as we know it, made his first appearance under Richard I, Richard Lionheart. The coroner keeps the pleas of the crown, or legal proceedings, and the word was at first crowner, and was later corrupted into coroner. He's elected. He travels a circuit, not just presiding over crimes of murder, but to make sure that these communities conduct themselves properly under the laws. In other words, he makes sure that all rules are followed and fines people who don't follow them. And he calls inquests into crimes. Henry II, in the 12th century, brought us trial by jury. Now, this isn't the kind of jury we know. This jury knows you. Today, the lawyers try to make sure that no one on the jury knows you and can influence the trial, but in medieval times, it was important that they did know you and could influence the trial. And it made sense. Remember the parishes that people lived in close proximity? That guaranteed that nothing could be devious and in secret. If everyone knows each other's business, then it's easy to point a finger and say, he did it. Choosing a jury was important because it is essentially this jury, made up of at least 9 to 12 and sometimes more men, would do the lion's share of investigating. They would talk to witnesses. They would examine evidence. It was pretty much a done deal when you got to trial, in a year or two, what the verdict would be. So let's talk murder, because that's what mysteries mostly like to deal with. There were two kinds of murder in the beginning. Murdrum, the slaying in secret, what we might call murder in the first degree today. Planned, carried out, and hidden. Then there was simplex homicidrum, unplanned, or murder in self-defense, or accidental. Later was added manslaughter, the slaying in hot blood, as in a duel, or if you caught your wife in bed with another man. Usually that counted when you slew the man, but sometimes it counted too when you murdered your wife. The degree of murder then, as it does now, depends on intention. Here's a quote from Henry de Bracton, a 13th century jurist, who wrote about the law and how to interpret it. Here he's talking about homicide through misadventure. As with where one intending to cast a spear at a wild beast, or does something of the sort, as where playing with a companion he has struck him in thoughtless jest, or when he stood far off when he drew his bow, or threw a stone, he has struck a man he did not see, or where playing with a ball, it has struck the hand of a barber he did not see, so that he has cut another's throat, and thus has killed a man, not however with the intention of killing him, he ought to be absolved, because a crime is not committed unless the intention to injure exists. So now, a body. A body is found by the first finder. It's up to him to call the hue and cry, literally crying out to the neighbors. He gets neighbors to help him investigate. The coroner's called. Now, if you're the first finder and you don't do these things, you can be fined pretty stiffly. So many first finders simply backed carefully out of the room and left it all for the next poor schlub. But let us suppose that the nosy neighbors turned up a likely suspect, and in many cases this happens because man A was heard arguing with man B the night before, and if man B suddenly turns up dead, then you'd naturally go to man A, and you'd likely be right. Same as today. Anyway, you've got a suspect. He is arrested and indicted by judges. Depending on his status in society, he might very well languish in prison until it comes to trial, and that could be a year or more. In the meantime, a jury is chosen from the people in the parish who knew the suspect and from the ward in which the crime was committed, which might be the same area, and they investigate it, talking to witnesses. Finally, it comes to trial, but it's mostly decided before the trial begins. On the right is a decent example of a courtroom. You've heard these terms before: a lawyer arguing before the bar, the judge serving on the bench. These terms that we still use today are very old and come from these sources. There is the bar, that the prisoner stands before, facing the judge or judges on a bench. Though I don't know what this thing is in the picture, just imagine it as a bench. Then there is the lawyer. The fellow on the left, who is fresh out of the Canterbury Tales as the man of law. If you can afford one, he comes with you to your trial, and he is a barrister because he stands before the bar. However, it isn't the lawyer who speaks for the prisoner. He isn't allowed to. The prisoner must speak and defend himself. Silence is construed as guilt. And by the way, neither the prisoner nor the witnesses are sworn in, as we do today, because it is assumed that they might lie, and the state didn't want to be responsible for their blaspheming themselves. Now the prisoner and the lawyer may question witnesses brought forth, and of course the lawyer can advise his client and file writs, but that's all he can do. Trials usually lasted no more than 10 minutes to half an hour, unless new witnesses could persuade the jury. You can see how that might be a short book. So I employed all sorts of delaying tactics to stretch out Crispin's murder trial. Here's a sample from the 14th century of a crime from the coroner rolls, which are pages and pages of records of that year's legal proceedings sewn together into one long roll, as you see in the picture of these Irish close rolls. Here it is. On Tuesday next, after the feast of St. Martin, 2nd November, the year aforesaid, 1300, information given to the aforesaid coroner and sheriffs that a certain Robert de Shoreditch lay dead of a death other than his rightful death in his house, which he held of Edmund Trentamars without Aldgate, in the parish of St. Botolph, in the ward of Portsoken. Thereupon they proceeded thither, and having summoned good men of the said ward, and of the 3 nearest wards, Billingsgate, Tower, and Bishopsgate, they diligently inquired how it happened. They say on their oath that when on the preceding Sunday a certain William La Wallier came to the house of the said Robert, and stole a tunic belonging to him, and pledged it with John de Ipswich, carpenter, for 7 pence. The said Robert, discovering this, sought out the said William, and found him whom he suspected, and assaulted him, ordering him to restore his tunic. That the said William, being terrified, said that he had pledged this tunic for 7 pence, offering to go with the said Robert to redeem it. That they proceeded together to the house of the said John before the hour of curfew, and entering it, the said William demanded the restoration of his tunic for the said 7 pence. That thereupon the said John, moved to anger, struck the said Robert under the right breast with a dagger, inflicting a wound 1 inch in breadth and 2 inches deep. That the said Robert lingered until Monday next, after the feast of St. Martin, and then died. How is it possible for a medieval detective to investigate? What could they know in a time period without scientific forensics to help them? I think this fellow was in trouble. One helpful thing was rigor mortis, meaning death stiffness. It starts from the face downward as soon as 30 minutes after death, but usually within 2 to 4 hours, and progresses down the body from the head, eyelids, neck, and then jaw, always in this order. After 8 to 12 hours, the body is completely stiff, called the rigid state, which can last about 18 hours. And then it begins to reverse in the same order, face downward, over a 12-hour period, called the flaccid state. So what is it exactly? Well, the blood stops flowing, and blood flowing prevents bacteria in the system from taking over. Chemical reactions happen in the muscle cells. That's why after you butcher a cow or a deer, you hang it for a period of time, allowing this reaction to soften the meat. Anyone ready for lunch? As it stiffens the muscles, at first it stiffens the muscles, but then the muscles begin to soften. That's when rigor mortis is done and putrefaction begins. As you can imagine, a warm environment encourages all that bacteria to quicken the process, like out in the sun or in a warm room. And cold slows it down, like in a refrigerator or in the snow or ice. What of lividity, or livor, bluish color, mortis, death, or post-mortem hypostasis, literally the after-death state? Well, when the blood stops flowing, it pools at the lowest point of the body. Wherever the body is in contact with the surface, the skin is pale and ringed by bluish bruising. So that means if the body is lying on the floor, the buttocks, the back of the thighs, the back of the calves, the shoulders, the back of the head, all would be pale, ringed by bluish, purplish bruising. When the heart stops beating and is no longer moving the blood, heavy red blood cells sink and languish at the lowest point it can reach. The place where the body is in contact would be this color too if the capillaries weren't squished by the body's own weight. So it pools around the lowest point it can get. See the picture there? It takes 20 to 30 minutes to several hours for lividity to take place and stays fixed after 8 hours. You could fix the time of death by this too, but it can also be used to tell if the body had been moved. For instance, if the body is found slumped over a table, but lividity is found on the back, you know that the body had been moved and therefore something fishy is going on. Now what about fingerprints? This is the science of the 19th century, 500 years after Crispin's time. Or was it? In Nova Scotia, cave drawings of a hand with all the ridges and lines associated with palm creases and fingerprints were created over 1,200 years ago. In ancient Babylon, thumb impressions in clay were used for business transactions. In ancient China, in the picture, thumbprints were used on clay seals. In 14th century Persia, some official documents show finger impressions. And a physician of the time was recorded to have observed that no two fingerprints were alike. But it wasn't until 1892 in Argentina that the first murder was solved by the use of comparing bloody fingerprints. Was there a possibility of using medieval fingerprints? No. There was no system in place to file them or to even know that they were individualized. That's why you'll see Crispin and others freely handle evidence. Was the justice system fair? Well, in 200 cases of homicide from 1281 to 1290 brought from Newgate Prison, only 21% were found guilty. Either there was some good detective work, or excellent bribes were meted out. You decide. How will Crispin fare behind bars with Jack doing the investigating on his own? What does the murder have to do with the mysterious relic of the Virgin Mary's tears? Who is Gibb? What evidence can be found to exonerate our hero? Well, you'll have to read the book to find out. Thank you for hanging out with me today. Don't forget to pose your questions on this page, and make sure you comment to be in the running for the giveaways. Happy reading!